Hello, I'm Jimmy Bach, and this is History with Jimmy, along with my producer Chandler Holmes, and this is episode 27. And today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people know about in this area, and it's called the Breaker Boys. And here we are today, and this is the beginning of this episode, and so we have a lot of things to show you, so we want to continue on. But the Breaker Boys were very important to this area, especially with coal mining being so prominent in this area. There were kids that, believe it or not, were as young as 5 years old. They end up working in the mines. And we want to tell a little bit of a story about them today, hear what they're doing, and the history of the Breaker Boys as we continue on. And so here's a picture. You can see the Breaker Boys here, and you can see these young boys. And many of them had to go into the mines to work to help support their family. And Breaker Boys started in the late 1800s and continued on until a gentleman by the name of Lewis Hine took photographs and actually helped change history and helped change child labor laws because of his pictures that are in this book, and I'm sure there's pictures other places that he has shown them and stuff. So we'll get into this story about Breaker Boys, and this is a book that's here at the FLT Museum. You'll also be able to have it down at the library downstairs, so if you'd like to take it out and read it, you're able to do so. So we'll continue on. This is a book. It's very interesting, and it shows some different pictures in this particular book. Here's another picture here showing the pictures of the Breaker Boys, and you can see they're very young. This is how they dressed in the mines, and they came home and probably wore the same clothes day after day, week after week, because of how dirty they got to. But one of the things that I want to point out to you is this with the Breaker Boys, is particularly how young they were, but the fact that they probably never got an education because they end up working in the mines their whole lives. Many of them died at a very young age, and specifically because of the work that they had to do. And so we'll continue on, and actually in the United States, believe it or not, coal started basically in Europe, but the Pueblo Indians found coal and burned it to cook food, make pottery, and then in 1673, French explorers found coal along the Mississippi River, and then decades later it was discovered in James River in Virginia. So, like I said, there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of history in this book, and so we're going to talk now about the Breaker Boys. One thing before we get into it, I'm going to show you this particular picture. And this is a picture of a gentleman who has a special mining lamp, of which we have one, that was used to help detect gas. And we talked about it in one of our previous episodes about the miners that were trapped for 5.5 days. And I'm not sure what episode that was, but some information that I found out about that particular episode afterwards, that the one gentleman who was only 22 years old, who survived that, told people that the reason him and the other gentleman actually got out is because they ended up eating the lunches of the men that were passed away. Another one that we found out was, another one of the gentlemen was there, his grandson told me that the story his grandmother told him about the grandfather was that when he actually, when they were able to get him out of the mines, he did not make it. They threw him on the ground and put a tag on him telling the grandmother that he owed money to the mining companies for getting him out of the mines. That's how bad it was, because the mining companies, the people that owned them, they were rulers, and they controlled the police and different things. You're going to hear about that in an episode that we have here concerning the Breaker Boys and stuff. So I'm going to show show you another picture of the Breaker Boys, and here's one here. And you can see these young boys, they're sitting there with a gentleman with a whip. And they were made to sit there. They worked maybe 10, 15 hours a day. And they developed black lung disease just like many of the regular miners did. And we also, of course, have the larger picture here showing the miners, these young kids there and stuff. And this is actually from Kingston. But Breaker Boy was a coal mining worker in the United States, and his job was to separate impurities from coal by hand in the coal breaker. They were primarily children. However, elderly coal miners who could no longer work in the mines because of their age, disease, or accident were also employed as breaker boys. And the use of the breaker boys began in the mid-1860s, right before the Civil War. And although public disapproval of employment of children as breaker boys existed by the 1880s, the practice did not end until 1920s, when Congress was convinced, finally, that these young kids should not have had to go work in the mines because they never got an education, and as I said, many of them died at a very early age. So, bituminous coal was something that was mined originally, but bituminous coal did not burn like anthracite did, which was mostly around here in this area. So, the breaker boys in all coal facilities were very labor intensive, and as they said 8 to 12 in here, but I have been told about kids as young as 5 years old going there. They worked for at least 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they would sit on wooden seats perched over chutes and conveyor belts, and they were there to pick out the slate and the other impurities out of the coal. The boys had to work without gloves. Now, can you imagine that they're picking up these sharp pieces of coal? Many times their hands got cut, they got infections and stuff. They had fingers amputated by the rapidly moving conveyor belts. Some lost their feet, hands, arms, and legs as they moved machinery or caught in conveyor belts and gears. Many were crushed to death, and their bodies retrieved from the gears of the machinery by supervisors, but they waited until the end of the day. They didn't stop anything. Nothing was stopped there. It was just that you had to continue working, and can you imagine some of these other young boys who watched this happen, but yet had to continue working on as they saw one of their fellow workers being hauled out of the mines who was crushed by machinery. Coal dust would kick up so much that the breaker boys sometimes wore lamps on their heads to see because of all this dust that ended up getting in their lungs, and asthma and black lung disease were common. The coal was washed to improve impurities, which created sulfuric acid. The acid burned the hands of the breaker boys. Finally, in 1885, Pennsylvania enacted a law forbidding the employment of anyone under the age of 12 from working in a coal breaker. The law was poorly enforced, and many employers forged proof of documents and families forged birth certificates so that their children could support their families. The estimated number of breaker boys that work in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania was widely and officially statistics generally considered by historians to not report the actual amount. One estimate was that 20,000 breaker boys working in the state of Pennsylvania in 1880, 18,000 working in 1900, 13,000 in 1902, and 24,000 working in 1907. But technological innovations in the 1890s and 1900s helped remove a lot of the things and cut down on the use of breaker boys. But by 1910, the use of breaker boys was dropping because of what I just said. Breaker boys were known for their fierce independence and rejection of adult authority, because all they knew was somebody standing over there every day telling them what they had to do. They often formed and joined trade unions and participated in a number of strikes in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania. Among these strikes were cultivated in the Latimer Massacre, which I'm going to talk about next. The massacre started September 10th, 1897. About 300 to 400 unarmed strikers, and most of them were Slavic and Germans, marched to a coal mine owned by Calvin Pardee in the town of Latimer, which was over near Hazleton. And their goal was to support the United Mine Workers Union, still open at the Latimer mine. Now, unions were not very strong in those days. The mine operators kept unions away. One of the things that they did this by was controlling the miners because they paid them in scrip. And scrip was something that they could only use because the mining companies owned general stores, they owned bars, they owned different things, and the only place you could spend that scrip was at the company store. And there's a gentleman that sang a song about this. So anyway, the deputies spent most of the morning joking about how many miners that they could kill. And while on a streetcar heading for Latimer with the sheriff and his posse, who were under control of the mine operators, one deputy was overheard saying, "I bet I can drop 6 of them when I get over there." When the demonstrators reached Latimer at 3:45, they were again met by the sheriff and 150 armed deputies. Sheriff Martin ordered the marchers to disperse and attempted to grab an American flag out of the hands of a lead marcher. A scuffle ensued, and the police opened fire on the unarmed miners. At least 19 miners were killed, 17 and 49 were wounded. Many had been shot in the back. Imagine that. Several had multiple gunshot wounds, which indicate they had been targeted by deputies. In the aftermath, the strike led to a temporary mass unrest in the area. Sheriff Martin telephoned for help for the National Guard, which was dispatched to the county to restore order. Later, on the evening of September 10, 1897, 2,500 troops of the 3rd Brigade, partially stationed in Luzerne County, had been deployed. The local Slavic community leaders held a rally on September 11th to try to calm the workers and raise money for the support of the families of dead and wounded and seek prosecution of Sheriff Martin and his deputies. Outrageous miners searched in vain on September 12th for the Lehigh and Wilkes-Barre Coal Company and Superintendent Gomer Jones, destroyed his house when they couldn't find him home, and on September 20th, a group of Slavic women armed with fireplace pokers and rolling pins led to some 150 men and boys to shut down the Mackinac Coal Works, but were turned back by the quick arrival of the National Guard. The Guard unit was withdrawn on September 4th, and the rest of the troops 25 days later. Sheriff Martin and his 73 deputies were arrested and put on trial. The defendants claimed that the marchers refused to obey an order and disperse, and were charging the sheriff and his deputies. But witness John Pusty gave a different account in formal testimony. "I was with the strikers when the shooting occurred. When we approached the sheriff, he walked to the middle of the road, told us to stop. Some of the men went forward, and I was heard 2 volleys from the deputies. None of the strikers were armed. I was shot in the right arm, and as I started to run, I was shot in the right leg. The ball entered from the back and coming out the front." Medical evidence showed that nearly all the strikers had been shot in the back. Nonetheless, the sheriff and his deputies were acquitted. The Latimer Massacre was a turning point in the history of the United Mine Workers and having struggled to establish itself in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. The massacre resulted in the dramatic entry of 10,000 new members joining the Union. The Breaker Boys were involved in this. And we have a list here, and if you come to the museum, you'll be able to see of the 21 men that were killed in the massacre at Latimer. So we have this here. So as we close this episode out, I want to point out to you that if you have younger children, younger youth in your family, so that they would understand that these Breaker Boys made a difference in their lives, because they went there and worked when there was no other work. They worked there to help put food on the table for their families. They never got an education. And many of them were embarrassed because they never learned to read, and many of them died at a very young age. So this is Jimmy Bach signing off with my producer Chandler Holmes on the history of the Breaker Boys, and I encourage you not only to see this episode, but come to the museum and you can hear more history about the Breaker Boys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for coming to the FLT Museum, as many of you have done. Thanks again.